You know, rap in Africa has spread its length and breadth in a variety, an array of ways that have either expressed the best of what Africa has to offer or the worst of what it does in order to try to fit into the Western paradigm. It's either or for me. I really feel like if one is to look critically at the history of rap and hip-hop generally as a culture and how it has spanned its development on this continent, you can see that we can separate artists in terms of those who have understood the American phenomenon as it comes to Africa and how to find the parts that can empower Africa through this movement, being that in its DNA it's made by people who mirror, who come from, and who yearn for an experience that comes to the African core. And then there are those artists who are basically swept into capitalist reproduction, and their concern is not so much with identity, but it's with power. And this is what I want to talk about using this particular review. For those who are familiar with this channel, Headspace, the most poignant pop channel in the continent, you know that what we deal with is an engagement with how the culture industry, popular fashion, capitalism is engaging with the people of the continent. How are Africans truly being empowered by capitalism, if they are at all, and how it brings itself across through the culture industry, that is advertising, popular culture, just the general foray of the things we experience when we look into media. So now, power, empowerment. This is a buzzword that I mention a lot during reviews. So for the purposes of this particular review, I felt the need to clarify it because I'm dealing with two of Africa's most powerful rappers. Undoubtedly, their careers have spanned a place where they are at what many would regard as the echelon of African popular culture and just the general mass marketed influence. I'm talking about Cassper and Nyovest on one side and Nasty C on the other. Now, for those who are familiar with the reviews, I usually do an individual artist and go into their particular body of work and how it filters into the current paradigm and how the sonic approach works or doesn't work. But today I'm cramming two artists into one. Why? Especially two importantly dominating artists. The reason for that is these two artists have, as of late, combined their forces to go on an African world tour and basically embellish the supremacy that they've bathed in for what many would say is over 10 years. And this feels like a crescendo. In other words, it feels like a moment where they are owning up to the fact that they are indeed Africa's most powerful rap duo as they combine themselves. So Cassper and Nasty C have now become a two-headed dragon that in some way seeks to represent the continent but also take what the best of what the continent can do in other parts of the world. Is this something they can do? And they released their albums on the same day. They're basically something that I don't think is coincidental. From a marketing standpoint, it works in their grand plan. It also works in where they both are in their careers. So, before I go into that, power. So for the purposes of this review, I'm going to define power as sustainable energy. Now, any definition you could have of power could basically filter into that. What do I mean? Power is the kind of approach, the kind of movement, the kind of influence that allows for you to have a resilient, staying force. Thus, I define power as sustainable energy. Whether on a level of culture, on a level of species, on a level of spirit. Power is that which we seek to attain a level of resilience, lasting energy. Because the one thing that the world is characterized by is change. So power is that which holds itself through change, which is able to maintain a level of integrity, stay together as many things fall apart. So whether we're talking about the influence of individuals, the influence of cultures, power is determined by their capacity to remain resilient and adapt through the changes. So why do I have to clarify power being sustainable energy? Because one, I said we're dealing with two of Africa's most powerful rappers. That means we're dealing with two of Africa's most sustainable rappers. And fair enough, they've been at it for longer than most. And the other reason is we're dealing with rap as it is expressed globally and how it empowers different cultures. So now, for the purposes of more clarity, I'm going to define culture. Culture, in this particular review, I will define as the ritualistic performance of power. So now remember, we said power is sustainable energy. How we keep ourselves together through change. And we do that through culture, through the ritualistic performance of certain attributes that keep that power for us. So think of yourself as you watch this review. The things that you do that influence you, you do because they allow for an image of you, an idea of you to maintain itself, a consistent thread to be known by the world and for you to better understand the world and allow for a consistent sense of identity. So in other words, we're all playing power games. The things that we choose to become, the people who we choose to be around, the music we choose to listen to, the cultures we belong to, it's all one power game. It's an elaborate set of power games, rather. And this power games, this power play, this theater of powers that we're all in this universe is what constitutes the development of all things. So now, going back to power being sustainable energy, there's two ways you could sustain your energy: oppressively or communally. Oppressively, what we call oppression, is when you try to sustain your power at the expense of something else. So you can survive by destroying something else. And that becomes oppression because you become something that imposes itself on another. Got that? Communally is when you try to work with another element by compromising and allowing for itself to compromise itself to get to a neutral place. So history has shown us ways of distributing power communally, where we're able to look at our differences and find out what we can let go of and what we can't in order to get to the best possible place to move forward, or to ignore that and assert ourselves and simply try to subject others. That is oppression. So when you understand these two kinds of power, oppression and communalism, then we're beginning to understand how when I review projects, I cannot leave out the politics of power. Nasty C and Cassper and Nyovest are both in what can be called a cusp. A cusp is a peak moment, a moment of the highest place possible. Because after the cusp comes a regression, just through time. So these two projects, Cassper and Nyovest's Solomon and Nasty C's I Love It Here, are both reflections of artists who are at their peak point of power, their sustainability, who culturally, their performance, the ritualistic performance of the ways that they've put themselves out in the world, have come to the place where they're in. So this review of both of their projects is an assessment of the kind of power that they have. Let's start with Cassper and Nyovest. Solomon is emblazoned in the local aesthetic of South Africa. I mean, the first time I saw this album cover, I was just in love. I am a big fan of the things, the unique elements that make us South African. Culture. Again, these ritualistic performances that empower us, that sustain us as South Africans. So to see Cassper and Nyovest clad in St. John's gear, standing in this esteem that feels to be a contemplation of his inner faith and also a reflection of South Africa's faith, ikubu, the rhythm, isingisetu. I thought to myself, this feels like it's going to be a good one. So I dived into it with those expectations. The album art really leads one to believe, in collaboration with this title of Solomon, the son of David, the most powerful king of Israel. And Solomon is known mainly in two ways. He's known as the most powerful and wisest king, but he's also known as, the man who ruined the kingdom by loving women and money too much. And this is the conflict of King Solomon. We have lust, but also at the very same time we have insight. So how does that connect to Cassper Nyovest? Because I wouldn't relate with him with either. He's just a unique individual in his own right. So he goes in, and from the moment that this album starts with Bashimane, it's a cruise control. The pacing, the driving force of how Cassper selected his beats is the most comfortable he's ever been in. Now, if you look at Cassper Nyovest's catalog, he's famously appropriated global styles. He's went from booming with Dog Shebeleza at the advent of trap and navigated himself through this unique style that was going on in South Africans, finding a way to appropriate trap in ways that ritualistically perform who they are. He was there for all of that. He jumped into the dorm scene. He jumped into the now dominant piano scene. So the one thing that I've always had with Cassper as a critique is that he's never really had a musical identity. Cassper rides with the waves that keep him safe. And with this one, he's done something different. He's unraveled a place where he creates what I call a neo-Motswako sound. I mean, it's reminiscent of the best of what the Motswako culture had to offer. Because Motswako wasn't necessarily a particular sound, but it did have markedly different features in the way that they did their boom bap through the production of people like Tasman. So as a result, I feel like we're in the era of Jaba, Tuksinganga, and now the drums are kind of different. They're bringing us into this luscious era of trap, but the sampling and the approach to the groove and the BPM is something that I feel honors the great Motswakolistas of old, but now is bathed in Cassper Nyovest's boss talk. Cassper Nyovest in this project reminds me of Rick Ross, and that's really peculiar because historically he's always either positioned himself as a kind of a Drake-like figure, and then he switches and goes to a maybe more Big Sean kind of figure. But to see Cassper embracing a kind of bossa nova, top of the world, cigar smoking, I am the chief facade, and that's not even a facade. Facade is the wrong word. I should rather say a boss demeanor, because he is that. This is the man who, in terms of endorsements and marketability, is one of the most lucrative artists in South Africa as a country, but practically in the continent as large. So here he speaks to that. He speaks to how he managed to get to this place. He speaks to the naysayers, and he does it all not rushing anywhere. And that's very interesting for Cassper, because I felt historically his albums have always felt like he's trying to chase his competitors to a place that is a little bit out of place for him. His bars have always felt a little cornier because he was always trying to either compete with the ultra lyricists or the ultra club bangers. And here, he's not trying to do any of that. He's so comfortable because he's already succeeded at all of that. He's done all the chasing, and now that his competitors are either retired at the end of their careers or dead, he is in a place where he looks around and there's practically nobody to stand before him and whatever his legacy is. Note the legacy feature. But I want to go into his subject matter. Cassper is literally just telling us about his rise to power. He's going into fatherhood, the struggles of co-parenting. On songs like Ever Changing Times, he emphasizes the fact that he's remained sustainable through the years, hence the sample. And he basically let all the haters know that for everybody that counted me out, this is for you. He goes into Candlelight, where I was really skeptical when I heard that he has a dedication for the great Keenan Forbes. But when I looked at it introspectively, I realized that, again, these power games that we play also can be games of rivalry. Some people act like they hate each other, and they might on a professional level, but it really isn't all that personal. It's competitive. It's like Coke and Pepsi. When you see the surface level, they're competitive products, but at the root, they're probably able to sit together and plot on the marketability of the product as in unison. Or politicians, when they're able to disagree on policy, but still sit together and have glasses of whiskey. I feel like Cassper reveals to us that the rivalry was hyper real. It was something that we bought into because they sold it to us. It allowed for them to make more success off of themselves by casting themselves against one another. And now that there is no rival to be against, Cassper is in a place where he can be real. He can be honest about the fact that throughout all of those years, it was never personal. It was always navigating capitalism. And it might have felt disrespectful. It might have been disrespectful on many levels. But the spats, the femtimes physical fights, were in the very same way that two athletes would go against each other, or two boxers would kick each other's asses and still be able to shake each other's hands when one emerges victorious. It's making a pact to be enemies because it benefits the both of us. And I think we learn from that. Again, it goes back to this idea of hyper-reality. If you don't know what hyper-reality is, zikhome, because you gotta watch the review I did earlier on Tyson Sabatelli's project. I'll post the links in the description. So this idea of hyper-reality, the perception of capitalism and the real you, this ever-changing idea, is something he manifests in this project. Going into project songs like It's Not the Same with the airy horns and an aspirational anthem, which I feel closes off this project. By the way, it's my favorite joint on the project because, man, it just booms with so much confidence. It's Grotman ready, but it's kid friendly. It's the kind of song that makes Cassper feel like a superhero and a villain in its own right. And therefore, to close this project off, it feels that Cassper gives us the essence of what it has been like to rise at the top by one, still remaining local. Let's respect that. Let's respect that culturally. Cassper remains South African. He ritualistically performed aspects that empowered us by taking the best of what the West and the global sphere of pop culture had to offer. I mean, even on this track, with a track where he does with Makela Dope Boy 018, it's again the appropriation of something else, drill, to try to find a way to bring it home. Let's celebrate that. Because artists like Cassper are cognizant of the fact that you can never truly be powerful if you're playing according to another person's cultural standard. You can never truly have the kind of communal influence that will allow for you to be understood and respected by the world if you are trying to imitate what another person is. Because those features come from their particular experiences. Say a lot about Cassper, but he's always understood that you've got to grab the linguistic, the aesthetic features of your own people, combine it with the best of what the rest of the world has to offer to make it. From the moment he used Doc Shebeleza's name as an anthem, to the moment where he used one of the most classical revered cars as an anthem, Cassper Nyovest career is a manual in how to culturally use your power. So again, remember power, sustainable energy, culture, the ritualistic performance of that power. What Cassper is saying in Solomon is that I am the king of cultural power. And I think this is where the Solomon attitude comes in. My critique, he uses something very powerful. The religious attitude of South Africa's history, the image of St. John, to sell this idea when this album really isn't spiritual at all. He doesn't go into how his capitalist rise has affected his morality. He doesn't really go into his general worldview now that he has money and how that affects his humanitarian efforts or even the need to be human. It doesn't really go into the spiritual aspect of being powerful. And this is where I think it fails, because for a project that embellishes itself and promises to be that aesthetically through the album cover, I feel taken for a ride. It is definitely not what I thought it would be thematically, but it is what I expected it to be subject-wise. Cassper is in a place where he can talk about nothing else but his success. But he uses South African themes of spirit to try and give us the impression that we're going into his soul, when really we've just remained in his ego, which might not be a bad thing. But let us contrast that with what Nasty is doing on the other hand. Nasty C, on the other hand, where Cassper has shown us how to use culture in a local sense, Nasty is known for sacrificing the local in order to reach the global. He's literally the most successful South African artist at globalizing themselves into pop culture. If I'm wrong at this, get at me in the comment section. So I want to go into the differences in that. How Cassper's local power has worked globally, and Nasty C's sacrifice of his local power has not worked for him globally. Let's go into it. The kid who wanted his motherfucking juice back and got it subsequently through praise from legends and novices alike is a fairy tale story that has swept predecessors and legends alike and newbies. Why? Nasty C's rise is typically associated with his talent, and that is true. He is literally one of the most brilliant reproducers of pop music I have ever heard. He's able to understand the kind of notes, hues and keys that work to creating the emotional structure that allow for people to bond with a song. His hook writing is exemplary. He's able to understand what kind of words to weave into the jargon and connect with what people are saying in the world, and how that ties into slang, and how to make that a piety, neat little thing to repeat over and over again. He's part of a generation that literally dawned itself in trap and allowed itself to live in the internet, and thus he's an artist of the hyper-real. And because of that, he's not really connected to the roots of who he is culturally. Many feel that's not even a problem, because they worshipped him and ushered him as the one who would lead the South African light. But let's look at that. I think that praise was colonial, because Nasty C doesn't express anything that is South African in his culture. Again, what is culture? Ritualistic performance of power. Whose rituals is he performing? Whose language is he expressing? There's absolutely nothing about Nasty C that says that he is Zulu. There's nothing about Nasty C that connects to where he's from. Nothing about Nasty C that leads you to the landscapes of Durban and its rich culture, its hybridization of being a land of indentured servant to being the place that allowed for so much African spirituality and culture to rise to the fore. I don't blame that on him. He comes from a generation that literally grew up on the TV set and dissolved in hyper-reality, the culture that was sold to them as powerful, which is Western culture. So as a result, I think Nasty C doesn't have a deep understanding of the fact that he is mimicking and gesturing a culture that only empowers the West and says nothing of his African nature. And therefore, people who celebrated him only celebrated him because he mimics the West so perfectly. And they want to do that because there's a room for Africans who know how to mimic the West with ease. They are put in an upper class of people who are able to become representatives of the model of African Western influence. And Nasty is that. his power doesn't truly give itself to who we are. It doesn't give itself to our economy. It doesn't give itself to our experience. It completely lends itself to America. He's gone from being like Drake or being like Cole or being like Kendrick to, in this particular era of American pop culture, being like Lil Baby. His approach to music is current, and had it not been the fact that his songwriting is genuinely emotional and comes from a place that resonates with a lot of heart, it would be easy to discard him as just another imitator. But no, his speciality is that he is able to infuse genuine emotion into the artificial landscape of pop music. And what that does is that he's able to stick long enough for the trend that he knows how to mimic, but he sacrifices who he really is. And I think this album is the first time where he might be realizing that. Seeing that over numerous interviews and communication that he's had with his fans on social media, he's been expressing his despondency and stress at not really penetrating into the American market. I mean, he's there, he's active, he's performing, he's fraternizing with all of our favorite rappers, but he's not being allowed into the gate. Ask yourself why. Because when he comes into America, sounding American, nothing about him is marketable. He could just be any other wannabe rapper on the streets. We think he's worth something because for us it was special to feel somebody who felt so global. But when he actually goes to this global center, he just becomes typical. And this is the predicament that Nasty C is in, as opposed to Cassper. Cassper works with his people in order to be allowed into the gate because he's not playing by the cultural rules of the West. He might be playing by the economic rules of the West because he's a capitalist, but he's not playing by the cultural rules of the West. He's not ritualistically performing something that is completely foreign to us. Nasty C, on the other hand, is. He might have tried to title his previous projects in a way that felt South African or African, but the Zulu man has no Zulu power. His power is completely Americanized. And therefore, now that he's actually in America, he's not special. And this is the predicament he finds himself in. So when I listen to songs like She's Gone and The End, which enters this project, the touching emotional origin story of being the son of a mother who was slayed even before he could really bond with her, from going into Endless, which goes into the gratitude and purpose and love he gets from his fans, to a song like Broken Marriages, which emphasizing his own growth. I mean, keep in mind now, the fundamental difference between Cassper and Nasty is also that Cassper is at the end of an era that is millennial. Nasty C, being 26 years old, is still filled with enough youthful life and insight to still be part of youth culture. Whereas Cassper is now at the end of his youthful power. So Nasty C still has time on him. And I think how he uses this time will determine his legacy. But it is in the song Release Me, number 4 on this project, which is a soulful, oozing, penetratingly honest song which goes into how he wants to be released. And I quote, he says, "I'm so guilty of not letting my fans see the real me." Again, hyper-reality. Call me if you haven't heard what I say about that. To him saying, "Allow me to reintroduce myself. If you allow me to be me and not reduce myself." What has he been reducing himself to? Ask yourself that. I mean, other parts of this song go into how he's able to make a chicken for himself that he feels is the best ever, just chill and watch series. It's being normal. It's the real him. It's understanding that he has a baby on the way and he's a bit anxious about that, and not playing into this power play of being a powerful rapper. This hyper reality he's created that he yearns to be free from, and in many a way has trapped himself into. Thus, this is my favorite song on the project because I think it ties together Nasty C's problem, but also the possible avenue into Nasty C's progress. Here we have another example of an artist who's a good reproducer of other people's styles, but is in a place where that's not doing much, and thus he seeks to be free from that. Somehow he seeks to be free from the illusion that he has allowed himself to go into, the illusion that many fostered him into by proclaiming him as the young wizard of South African hip-hop, by proclaiming him the coolest kid in Africa, when nothing about him except for his skin connects to the actual continent in and of itself. So when he titles this project I Love It Here, it feels he loves it in the place that he's in. Where is he? He's in a place where he's achieved the geographical shift to being an American artist, but now is the time to find out how to become that in a way that is uniquely African. And that is still a lingering question mark, because the subject matter, apart from what he does in Endless, which is kind of appropriate the Afrobeat sound, and what he does on his song with Amifaku, he has moments where he understands the African trends that have worked, such as Afrobeats. But he's brave enough to not go into territories that wouldn't really work with his style, such as piano. And one can respect him for that, because he's still trying to be authentically him, a rapper, a trapper, but somebody who's also African. But his possible demise and his mistake has been that he has thoroughly played to a Western game. Culturally, he has ritualistically performed other people's power. And thus, to compare these two artists' legacy, Cassper is in a place of communalism. He has bonded with his people, bonded with his fans. Many of us, to a large extent, see him as an emblem of pride, because whether you like him or not, he's taught us a lot on how to navigate capitalism while still maintaining your African identity in the musical market. Nasty, on the other hand, is in a level of oppression, because he finds himself subjected by the very same American culture he thought would free him. So in the ultimate commentary of this review, what we learn from both artists are different approaches to trying to be influential. And Cassper seems to be working well, even though many might confuse the notoriety of fame with a kind of endless influence. What it is where do you want to be when the narrative of where you come from to where you wanted to go is all said and done? Do you want to be recognized as somebody who played to the rules of other people's power, or do you want to be understood as somebody who brought their history into the window of global marketplace? So ultimately, on an individual level, I want to give Cassper Nyovest a solid 7 out of 10. It's a refreshing approach to an artist who's always chased the hype, because he's now living and breathing in a hype of his own, which ironically comes from chasing the hype. So I guess at some point you run the race and you get to a place that's satisfactory for you. Salute to Cassper for that. On Nasty C's side, I also give it a 7 out of 10, because the songwriting is superb. The emotional connection and vulnerability that he has with his audience has always maintained itself, but there's a lingering sense of identity that is lost. 7 is a good number. It's a biblical number. Cassper used the biblical character. Nasty C deals with a lot of what the spirit has to offer that Cassper really doesn't. So I feel all in all, we're in an era where, as the audience, we're watching what it truly takes to be global. It has been said, act local, think global. And I think Cassper implored that, whereas Nasty C tried to act global, because he felt that in that way it would allow for him to think locally. But that logic is mismatched, if not completely confused. But again, I think it's because he's young. I think it's because he was born into the hyper reality of capitalism, and his life must feel a little bit like a movie or an advert, so he's not able to identify culture from a political perspective. Whereas Cassper, being a millennial, is grown enough to identify that the things that are yours will work for you when you are in a place that isn't. So ultimately, shout out to both artists, because I mean, they are at the end of the day part of this growing story of South Africans touching base with the rest of the world. They're a story of African influence, and like I said, they're the two most powerful rappers on the continent. And nobody can say that if they haven't truly been impactful, both in a negative and a positive sense. So this is not a moral narrative. Casper's not wrong or right. Nasty C isn't wrong or right. They're both just trying to navigate their path. And what I am here to do is make sense of that path according to power, sustainable energy. So if you want to sustain your energy, your culture, your influence, your being, your identity, as change moves on, if you want to understand how to evolve, I think this dialogue and understanding some of these concepts is very, very important. And if you haven't been listening to that, then is it coming? My name is VJ, the brother from the ancient mother. Please subscribe if you haven't. This is what we do as the most poignant culture channel on the continent. Mwah.